Hello and welcome to Divine Encounters. Here, we share powerful testimonies of those who've died, fallen into comas, and witnessed the mysteries of the afterlife. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. By doing this helps us spread the gospel to the world. John Todd Collins was born into a name that carried Weather Collins, a clan whispered about in the margins of family trees and town histories. Children in his town told their own smaller legends, that his bloodline had brought witchcraft to Salem, that somewhere in the genealogy there were courtyards, seals, and a woman whose name had been carved into a bay. For John, those whispers were not stories. They were a living, breathing inheritance. By 8, he had cast his first spell. By 13, the coven in Columbus had him working through the apprenticeship, never asking why, only doing. When he asked, they scolded him for being naughty. When he stopped asking, everything moved faster. Initiation at 14. Priesthood at 18. They gave him a name to wear in public, Lance Collins, and a title to carry behind closed doors, High Priest, then Grand Druid. With each elevation, his world spread outward, more covens, more secrets, more rituals, whose rhythm he followed the way most people follow the clock. He believed, with the stubbornness of the raised and taught, that the gods of witchcraft were real. He believed in spirit guides and in the fixed lines of personality the stars had written at his birth. He believed the occult had logic and power. He believed until the night he learned that the power they worshipped was not a god at all, but a mimic, familiar spirits, demons pretending to be something divine. The coven taught him the mechanics of influence. It taught him how to push at the seams of people's lives and governments, how to cede favors and call in debts. It taught him that the world could be moved, that the rich and useful could be bought, and the right appointments made. It taught him that the structure of their world, pyramids of power, capstones of secrecy, was older and more patient than any single lifetime. So when John found himself standing in a stockade in Germany after a street shootout, facing the prospect of Leavenworth, the coven's network moved on his behalf. A phone call to a foster mother, an envelope with a one-way ticket to New York, senators and congressmen who arrived in a cell and left him with an honorable discharge. Each intervention was a stitch in the great tapestry his order could weave. He learned how deep the tendrils ran. Covens seated in military bases, occult lodges with university affiliations, and money that flowed through banks most people assumed were neutral. Still, he treated it like a game for a while. He thought the charted plans for world takeover were fantasy, the prophetic timelines a kind of role play for the powerful. Then he saw a sealed courier pouch, opened at a Grand Druid meeting in San Antonio. Letters spilled across a table. Money, instructions, and then 2 final pages. An 8-year, step-by-step plan ending in December of 1980. And a sentence that chilled the marrow out of him. We have found a man who we believe to be the son of Lucifer. They believed he could be made the ruler of the world, stop wars, bring a false peace, and they intended to back him. It was the last thread he needed to reconsider everything he had been taught. If the entire thing, which to him until that moment had felt like institutional theatrics, was aimed at practical dominion, at promises of power large enough to swallow nations, then the stakes were not a witch's vanity or an occult game. The stakes were people. For John, the unraveling came in ordinary cruelty, addiction. He spiraled into meth and paranoia to the point where his body betrayed him. He dropped to 149 pounds and could think only through the fog of craving. One Labor Day, the supply he depended on failed to arrive. He wandered through San Antonio, hollow and raw, and sat in a cinema to kill time. The picture that played was the cross and the switchblade. To an initiate in the occult, the film should have been nonsense. Instead, he watched a miracle happen on screen, a life transformed, a man who had been lost become whole. He laughed, scoffed, and then felt something different: confusion, like a cord being cut. A Baptist minister who had come hunting in the occult shops of the city because his own daughter had been initiated, found John in a storefront and began to pray. Whether by fool's courage or desperate hunger, the preacher spoke into John's life, as if the words themselves were tools, commands against unseen oppressors, prayers that broke whatever communication had sustained John's spirit for years. The spirits, which had always been a constant murmur in his ear, fell silent. Alone in that silence, an ordinary young man handed John a tract at the theater door. He walked away into the night. The tract, titled "Bewitched," felt absurd in his hands. He tossed it aside. He couldn't sleep. The next night, he went to a coffee house the occult had wanted to shut down, a place that had once been a burlesque house and had been unexpectedly converted into a revival space. There, in the close cold of a late-night room, a pastor started talking to him. He listened because he had nowhere else to go. He listened because the silence of his spirit guides felt like an ache. And as the pastor prayed, John felt something heavy lift. When the weight left him, he discovered his own mind for the first time. The cotton in his head, years of directive whispers, of inherited commands, cleared. He could choose. He could think. He walked out of that coffee house not as a man fleeing punishment, but as one who had been found. Conversion did not end the danger. It magnified it. A grand druid who has turned Christian is an anomaly and a threat to an entire machine. Bounties were rumored. Friends who'd left before him had been killed. He received warnings and knew the names of those the order hated: ministers, authors, a publisher. Yet the thing that shook him most was not the threats, it was the knowledge of scale. He had seen charts, letters, and transactions. He had stood at tables where plans were discussed and money moved. He had counted covens, priests, and a network that reached into banks and governments. Once free, John dedicated the dangerous remnant of his life to telling what he'd seen, to rescuing addicts, to holding the hand of people emerging from the occult, to standing on pulpits and in coffee houses, saying the two things he had learned in literal blood: that the spirits that posed as gods are demons, and that the power the world fears is no match for the power he had found. When people clapped and called amen in the congregation where he spoke, they were responding to more than a story. They were responding to a man who had been born into a lineage of darkness, and who had, by a series of fragile and miraculous interventions, prayer, confusion, a broken Coke machine at 2 a.m, found a different inheritance: choice. He kept speaking because the voices that once told him how to live had to be drowned out by testimonies. He kept speaking because, as he would tell anyone who asked, fear was not the right response. The right response was to get angry not with the past, but with the power of the past, and to fight with the only weapons he trusted now: truth and prayer. The room had settled into a hush when John finished that night, people breathing like they'd been holding their own. But his life didn't pause with the applause. What followed was a long, dangerous season of consequence and repair. Word spread fast through the circles he had left. Some in the occult sneered at his conversion. Some wanted to understand. Others marked him as a traitor. Bounties, whispers, and late-night calls became part of the background noise of his life. Agents of the old world tested boundaries with small intimidations. At first, mysterious cars at odd hours, friends who stopped returning calls, the sense of being watched. Later they escalated. Attempts to sabotage meetings, anonymous letters, people who showed up where his wife was traveling on ministry business. He learned to travel with caution and to measure which meetings were worth opening up to large crowds. But danger never outweighed the work. The phone calls that kept him up at night were not all threats. Many were from the people he now served. Former witches, addicts, and lonely seekers found their way to him because he could speak the language of both worlds. He learned to translate, to listen to the residue of fear left in someone who had known spirit guides, to help them name the particular lies they'd been told, and to show them that healing could come step by step. He and his wife built a small network of safe houses, counseling nights, and testimonies, places where ex-initiates could sleep, detox, and begin to think for themselves again. One winter evening, a man arrived at their door, gaunt in his face and shaking with withdrawal. He had been a high priest in a Midwestern lodge, a man who'd once been certain of the stars' dictates and the power of ritual. For months he'd tried to stop, but had nothing to replace the steady counsel of his spirit guides. John sat with him for hours, refusing to give simple answers. He prayed, read Bible passages aloud slowly, asked questions he knew how to ask because he'd been asked them himself in initiation rooms. On the third night, the man slept through the night without nightmares for the first time in decades. There was no cinematic revelation, only small, stubborn peace that returned like a tide. That was the work John loved. Slow, ordinary, holy. Not every reunion with his past was hostile. A handful of former colleagues tried to understand, guardedly. Some were angry. One or two asked him how he had come to be free and then quietly, over months, slipped into his circle and were changed. He kept his contacts, only the prudent ones, and sometimes they provided him information that saved lives. He never trusted the old world again the way he had, but he learned how to use his knowledge to protect others. Where once he'd used spells to control outcomes, he now used what he knew about schedules and networks to keep people safe. Family, however, was the hardest battle. The Collins line ran deep and stubborn in its pride. Relatives who had once celebrated his rise in the coven could not at first accept his new life. Some called him a traitor, some mourned as if he'd died. There were days he wanted to leave the past buried in silence, but the broken ties called him back. He spent long afternoons writing letters, making slow visits, and sitting in kitchens where old family curses sometimes sounded like jokes at first, and then like threats. On more than one visit, a cousin locked him out of a family meeting. On others, a younger relative sat quietly and listened as John told the story, not to shame, but to warn. One summer, a great-aunt elder in the old ways came to the trailer where John and his wife counseled. She had been well respected in those circles, a woman whose hands had mixed herbs and whose memory carried old rites. She did not come to mock. She came with a small box and a slower walk. For weeks she sat across from John, saying little. Finally she placed the box between them and told him, simply, that she'd been afraid for him, and for her entire line. She had seen the costs. She had buried 2 children she suspected had been taken by the violence that followed those who tried to leave. She had known fear and had practiced it like prayer. But she also said, she had seen him change not by show but by steadiness. He had not become loud or unkind. He had become gentle. She wanted, in the small way she could, to bless the new path he had chosen. Those moments of soft reconciliation kept him going. They were not a complete triumph. Old loyalties die slowly, but they were proof that the work of transformation was not merely symbolic. It altered relationships, sometimes painfully, and sometimes tenderly. John's preaching matured. At first he thundered with the energy of someone who had been dragged free, and wanted everyone to know the cost, the victory, and the urgency. Over time, he learned another voice, the one that sat in the presence of someone at 3 a.m. who could not stop shaking. He learned to pair fire with compassion, to call out the lie that people were helpless, and to offer them practical steps toward freedom, prayer strategies, trustworthy counselors, detox programs, and community care. He taught discernment without paranoia. Fear paralyzes, he'd tell the anxious, but watchfulness and disciplined prayer protect. One of his proudest ministries took shape around helping ministers. Because he knew how the occult's money and influence worked, how they could bribe, silence, and seduce, he helped churches set up safeguards, financial transparency, accountability teams, and counseling resources, so ministers wouldn't be vulnerable to the kinds of compromises that had allowed occult influence to creep into congregations. He counseled small pastors who couldn't be bought and had been targeted, connecting them to legal help or neighboring churches willing to open their doors. Yet the specter of prophetic timetables and secret charts never left his mind. The chart he had seen, the 8-year plan ending in 1980, had not been a fantasy. Whether or not every date was kept to the hour, he had seen too much corroborating evidence to dismiss the organized ambition behind the occult networks. John used the knowledge not to spread conspiracy fever, but to press a relentless insistence. A waking church matters. He pushed for prayer gatherings in cities and for Christians to engage in civic life wisely. He implored his listeners to learn how influence actually worked: banks, media, education, so faith would be exercised wisely, not as blind trust or naive escape. Traveling for ministry meant living with complexity. He learned to read an event before he walked through the door. Who invited him? What money was attached? Whether others in the room had been compromised? He refused certain invitations. He accepted others because a single converted life waiting in a coffee house could change generations. In living rooms and auditoriums, in small counseling centers and late-night phone calls, John told what he'd seen with the frankness only an insider could muster. He never glorified his past. He told it plainly, as warning and as context. And he repeated, until it was almost a beat in his sermons, what the preacher had once prayed over him, that the power he had served was defeated. He told people not to tremble at the mention of the enemy, but to arm themselves with prayer, clarity, and the companionship of others who would stand with them. Years folded into one another. Some of John's earliest converts would grow to be counselors themselves. A handful of the children who had once been in the coven's outer courts were now teachers in schools founded to help at-risk youth. He watched patterns shift slowly. Laws were challenged in courts where occult groups claimed religious protections. He watched ministers press to accept donations with hidden strings and learned alongside them how to say no. He saw institutions he had once thought immovable crack under the pressure of transparency and faithful exposure. And through it all, he kept returning to a simple demand: that Christians not be afraid of naming darkness, but also not be obsessed by it. He wanted courage, holy, disciplined courage, not drama. He wanted churches to be sanctuaries of real care, not just signboards of righteousness. He wanted people who had once been used and discarded to find churches that would wrap them in ongoing care. On a cold spring night, years after he'd first walked out of that coffee house, John stood again on a stage older, with lines at the mouth and a steadier cadence. The auditorium smelled of coffee and old hymn book. He looked out at faces, some skeptical, some eager, and told one more story about a man who had been a grand druid. He told about the sealed pouch, the chart, and the terrible clarity that had opened in him. He told about fear and bounties, and about a love that kept chasing him down in movie theaters and coffee houses. When he finished, he did not ask for applause. Instead, he asked for one thing: that they would carry the names of the hurting with them, that they would be ready to welcome those who seemed dangerous or strange, and that the church would not give way to either complacency or panic. He asked them to pray not like children hiding under the table from monsters, but like watchful gardeners, steady, attentive, and willing to get their hands muddy. A woman in the back raised her hand and, voice trembling, told him she had grown up in a family steeped in belief in the occult, and that she had never felt safe to speak about it in church before. She said she'd been thinking about coming forward for years, and she wanted to say thank you. A young man near the front, who'd once been into drugs, hugged the person next to him until they both laughed through a cry. These were small, ordinary victories, but now they stacked like armor. John left that night and walked into the chill with his wife at his side. They moved cautiously through the world he had once tried to govern. He still watched the papers for odd coincidences and kept a small, careful network of people who could be trusted. But he also slept, most nights, with the steady, ordinary peace of a man who knew where his true power lay. At the end of his life, When people asked what he would say to someone born into the dark or tethered to its ways, he always answered with the same two lines. Don't be surprised by the darkness you were given, eyes to see it. But also don't be afraid, there is a light strong enough to undo what the night pretends to own. And he would smile. Not because his past had been erased, but because the past had been redeemed into a tool that rescued others.